Right-wing Democrat Joe Manchin, who will apparently be a key player in passing the Biden stimulus package, announced yesterday that he'll, quote, vote to begin the process of passing stimulus bill using the budget process, but that he opposes the part of the bill that raises the minimum wage to $15.
It's the beginning of many of his demands. He's going to take that stance despite many polls actually showing a majority support for raising the minimum wage in his own home state as well. Specific Data for Progress poll here showing 63% of all voters in favor of the raise, including 86% of many Democrats. So, Democratic strategist, founding partner in Northern Star Strategies, Michael Starr Hopkins, and co-host of the Realignment podcast, Marshall Kosloff, they're here to weigh in. Really interesting situation developing here, Michael, because it's not just about the minimum wage in particular. Manchin has raised, has raised hell about these $2,000 checks. Originally said absolutely not, walked that back. You and I were just discussing this morning. He basically came out for a more targeted version of the bill. But he's somehow found himself actually to the right of the billionaire Republican governor, Jim Justice, who actually called him out yesterday on cable news saying, hey, we actually need this $1.9 trillion bill. So what are the dynamics that are going on here?
I think Senator Manchin is trying to play both sides of the fence to a little bit. I think he's trying to appeal to conservatives in West Virginia while also trying to keep that Democratic base. But like you said, things are kind of coming full circle because you have Republican governors now coming out in support of this $1.9 trillion bill and in fact saying we need even more. So, I think Manchin's going to have to listen to his constituents while also figuring out how to play the game. And I think that's been his hardest part.
Yeah, and Marshall, I think this exposes how little understanding there is in our national political conversation, especially among political elites. The distinction between the popularity of left economic policies, which, look, when a vast majority of Americans support $15 minimum wage, you could dispute whether that's really a left economic policy. But the distinction in the popularity between policies like that and social policies, and basically Joe Manchin has maintained power in the state by being on the right on every issue, but especially where he really actually lines up with a lot of West Virginia voters is on these social conservative issues. He's actually out of step. His position right now is out of step with where West Virginia citizens are in terms of what they would like to see the government do.
Yeah, the thing that's frustrating about this is I think we should separate the stimulus package decision from the minimum wage decision because I think that's entirely him to, reference Michael's point, just trying to play the game, trying to be the power player. But as Sagar pointed out, he walked it back. It's not quite clear. It's pretty arbitrary, him saying he wouldn't do $2,000, but for some reason, like a $300, $200 difference makes a difference there. That is separate, though, from the conversation we should be having about the minimum wage, because when we talk about the $15 minimum wage, I think we really should remember this is a strong case where I actually think this is probably the most conservative thing I'll ever say on the show, that there is a case for a federalist approach here in the sense that West Virginia's economy is very different from New York's economy. So I unabashedly would support a $15 minimum wage in New York, but there is actually a legitimate debate to be had about whether or not pushing up the minimum wage in a very rural state like West Virginia wouldn't actually result in automation, potential job killing things, and it's pretty arbitrary. I think the thing that we should be doing instead at the federal level is definitely raising it, into the tens. So that's where I agree with the 11 point. It's too low right now as a floor, but we should be passing things like the earned income tax credit, raising that, which would make it so that we can make every single person who's working in this country actually not have to live in poverty without forcing West Virginia's economy to structure itself the same way as New York City's or Florida's or California's.
I completely take that point, and I think it's legitimate. It's also, it's important we also have that view here on the show. Marshall, I guess the question is that, as you say, disaggregate then your minimum wage point, where I think it's legitimate, Manchin's thing, and talk about his general opposition and deficit mindset whenever it comes to this stimulus, because that is actually quite rooted in a disconnect from West Virginia, and it's pretty empirical that a larger stimulus would be better for more West Virginians. And as we said, his own governor, Republican governor of his state, is actually pressuring him in order to vote for a larger stimulus package, minimum wage aside.
Yeah, and that's where we entirely agree. The key difference here is when it comes to the stimulus package decision, it's basically fake. And I'd also say it's largely in bad faith. It seems pretty clear to me that specifically on the stimulus package numbers, because the numbers are pretty arbitrary and because the quote unquote national debt discourse, in my opinion, is pretty vague, it doesn't actually mean anything. And he's actively choosing these hypothetical, feared in the future without any clear, tangible, actual consequences over people's lives right now. With the minimum wage debate at the same time, though, there is actually, I think, a strong case to be made that there needs to be a specific targeted approach with the EITC, with specific nature of what West Virginia. But yeah, you're totally right on the debt and deficit hawkery.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, what West Virginia needs, Michael, is both higher wages and more jobs and better jobs. I mean, this is a state that's been exploited for years and years and years, sold out to coal barons. Corrupt politicians like Joe Manchin been an integral part of basically pandering to the people in the state on social cultural issues and selling out to them on the corporate side, being in the pocket of the big energy interest in the state. There just isn't evidence to support the idea. Of course, at some level, if you raise the minimum wage too high, you're going to suffer some job loss. There just isn't evidence that $15 is that level. So far, what we've seen in the research and the studies is that it hasn't had a significant impact in terms of joblessness. So look, it's all about where you're going to set the floor. It's still going to be a federalized approach. New York City should set their wage higher than $15 an hour. So should LA, so should a lot of places. But the floor in this country, I don't think it's unreasonable to say, should be, above the poverty level.
Yeah, and I'll remind people that if we had pegged inflation, or rather pegged the minimum wage to inflation over the last 50 or so years, the minimum wage would be around $24. So this isn't some revolutionary idea. But to pull this back to about 30,000 feet view, I think what Senator Manchin is experiencing is, 3 or 4 administrations of really messing this up and giving air to this populist movement. Whether it's Occupy Wall Street, whether it's Wall Street bets, we're seeing people really fed up with this idea that corporate interests keep getting money, but the average American isn't. I mean, even when you look at PPP, what you saw was people not getting money from the government and these corporations really getting first access, getting corporate buybacks, buying all these fancy things, and that money not trickling down. Surprise, surprise. Right. And so I think now what really the pressure is 3 things. People want to make sure that they're getting shots in their arm for the vaccine, that they're getting kids back to school, and that they're getting their checks in the mail. And if the Biden administration can accomplish those 3 things, then 2022 is going to be a whole different year. And I think that's where Senator Manchin really has to refocus.
Yeah, well, what you just laid out is literally the most popular program you could ever enact, and yet doesn't seem to be on a sprinting road to happening, which is mystifying. Yeah. All right, guys, stick with us. We're going to have more Team Rising right after this.